All right. My name is Taj Moten, and today I will be presenting the life of Todor Zhukov for my Western Civilizations presentation. Okay, for Zhukov's childhood and family life, he was born in 1911 in the Bulgarian village of Pravets. He came from a peasant background. Both his mother's side and his father's side of the family were relatively poor. They weren't living in constant poverty, but they definitely weren't upper class or even upper middle class. He joined the Bulgarian Communist Youth Union in 1928 when he was 17. And then 4 years later, he began to serve as a secretary to the Second Borough Committee. Um, a couple years after that, in a coup, all political parties were banned where he lived, but Zhukov kept his post and just had a different role in the organization. For Zhukov's rise to power, he participated in Bulgaria's resistance movement. And in 1944, he became the head of the Sofia Police Force, which was renamed the People's Militia. Um, and then after Stalin's death, Chervenkov gave up his post as general secretary and became prime minister. And Zhukov was actually selected to take his place, but he was more of a figurehead and he didn't have as much power at first. But after Nikita Khrushchev's famous speech against Stalin, Chervenkov was demoted. And then Zhukov became the de facto leader of Bulgaria and was recognized as such by the people of Bulgaria. So liberalization. Zhukov led de-Stalinization movements in Bulgaria. In association with this, he was very against personality cults, even for himself, as we'll discuss. So he tried to disperse those. He removed statues of Stalin, Chervenkov, and even himself. In his hometown, there was a statue resurrected of him, or erected of him, but he denied it and had it removed. He also pardoned and rehabilitated many convicted people that were once convicted in the People's Court, which had been abolished since. And another thing that he did to contribute to liberalization is he removed monopolies on things such as art and culture. There was an attempted coup against him. Former partisan leaders and military took a critical stance to his liberalization tactics. And then three generals, General Todor Gurinia, Anev, and Krustev, planned to overthrow him in 1965, and they gained military support. But that plan was exposed later that year. And these three men, along with other people plotting, were expelled from their parties, and some of them were even arrested. So then this is where his rule begins more seriously. This was his time as a prime minister. He served from 1962 to 1971. Zhukov was faithful to the Soviet Union, but he, as previously stated, had more liberal agendas, such as he allowed surplus goods to be sold for individual profits. A lot of this had to do with crops. So if farmers had excess crops, they could sell the rest of them for their individual gain, which is obviously not a super inline thing with like Stalin and previous rulers. And he ended persecution of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. Obviously, that was a big thing before his rule. Religions were definitely criticized, so that was a big movement. So yeah, in 1970, he proposed an update to Bulgaria's constitution. It was named after him, the Zhukov Constitution. He gave, in this constitution, he gave labor unions and youth groups the right of legislative initiative, so they could present laws and stuff to courts and get their own movements going. He created and appointed a collective head of state in the state council. So this was not one person; it was actually a group. And the power. He also made sure that power was shared between the Communist Party in Bulgaria and the Bulgarian Agrarian National Union. So this was dispersing power. In 1971, the Constitution was approved through a vote where it passed not unanimously, but it was very popular. His amendments were very popular. So his time as a chairman of the state council, after his update to the constitution passed, Zhukov resigned from his position, and he was made chairman state of council in 1971, the same year, so which is equivalent to president. He helped create the new economic model in the 70s. I mean, this actually didn't get approved until the early 80s, I believe, in 1981. But he helped create it, and he also, as his time as chairman of state council, he improved disease control prevention. He had lots of movements to get testing for things such as HIV and other um, controllable things in this field. And he made great strides in educational improvements. He unified education and also introduced in the early 80s computers to schooling systems, which, as we know, is very important. So yeah, his downfall began as he tried to assimilate Bulgarian Turks by changing their names to Bulgarian names. So if they had Turkish names, he basically forced them to change their names to Bulgarian names, which lots of Turks, rightfully so, believed that their identity was being stripped from them. So this was definitely a major problem. In 1984, some peaceful protests broke out, but unfortunately, that did not last for long because those protests started to turn violent. Some blamed the protesters and others blamed the police, but a man was killed in one of these protests, and that escalated things. And then the protesters started setting off bombs in government buildings and other areas in Bulgaria. And obviously, this is a form of terrorism. So they're retaliating against his rule. Um, Zhukov encouraged people to leave Bulgaria if they were not happy. But ultimately, this backfired because because 350,000, a little bit over 350,000 Turks fled the country because of his new laws, and this was devastating for the economy, obviously. Um, and Zhukov was later kicked out of office for his failures, especially to do with this, and he was prosecuted in court. So his later life and death. He was put on house arrest in 1994, but later exonerated. They actually tried him to be executed, but his charges were not concrete enough to do so. Um, he wrote long memoirs detailing his own failures and views in socialism. In his last days, he believed that uh, socialism would ultimately prevail, but the way that he did things, he made mistakes into which that it was not like completely how he wanted it to be by the end of his rule. He even criticized his own party members in his last interview, saying that they were doing things wrong as well, which is interesting because he didn't even critique the right wing opposition as much in this last interview. He more focused on his own party's shortcomings. And then, yeah, so in 1995, he died a free man. His charges were actually reversed, but at this point of his life, he was already really old and starting to get sick, and had some diseases that ultimately led to his death. But he died in 1995. So his legacy has continued in Bulgaria through pop culture, songs, arts, things of that nature. He's had, after his death, he's had statues erected in his honor all across Bulgaria. He's been written about in books, and he's had relatively high approval ratings throughout his career. Obviously, those dipped down towards the end of his career due to his controversies with the Turks, but he had a top 5 overall rating, approval rating in Bulgarian official history. So he was widely accepted as a good ruler, and he was viewed as a fair and just ruler for the most part by the Bulgarians. Of course, like I said, towards the end of his reign, not so much, but for the majority, he fought for people's rights, which was really important, obviously, to many Bulgarians. And this is why he was widely accepted. And here are my sources. Thank you for listening. And yeah.